Dance this tango flawlessly, and I will marry you, right here, in front of everyone. The mocking challenge of Chief Tunde Adeyemi, one of the wealthiest hotel magnates in West Africa, cut through 200 flutes of champagne and stopped the orchestra mid-tune. Laughter rippled through the ballroom of his Banana Island residence, easy and cruel, the laughter of people who had never once had to wonder where their next meal was coming from. But the moment the girl in the housekeeping uniform took her first step, the laughter died in every throat in that room, as if something ancient had walked in behind her and demanded silence. Adaeze Nwosu was about to become the most talked-about person in Lagos by morning. She would spend the next several hours convinced she was about to lose the only job keeping a roof over her head. 6 hours earlier, the Adeyemi residence blazed with light. Chandeliers doubled in the polished marble floors. 200 of Nigeria's wealthiest guests circulating in silk and tailored linen. Chief Tunde Adeyemi was turning 68 that night, and the party marked more than a birthday. It marked 40 years since he'd inherited his father's 3 hotels and turned them into a chain that now stretched from Lagos to Abuja to Nairobi. A name printed on glass towers, most of the staff serving drinks that evening would never be able to afford to sleep in. That morning, Adaeze had spent 4 hours polishing the silver that would be used exactly once, and then locked away again until the next occasion warranted it. She'd counted out place settings for 200 guests, ironed table linens until the creases fell in perfectly straight lines, and helped the head cook portion grilled tilapia onto trays small enough to be carried gracefully through a crowd without ever once drawing attention to the person carrying them. It was work she'd done 100 times before, work that asked for precision and offered no credit in return, and she had learned, over 4 years, to take a private pride in doing it well anyway, since no one else in that house was going to notice if she didn't. "You're quiet, even for you today," said Blessing, the other housemaid on shift, folding napkins into small fans at the next table. "Big night," Adaeze said, which was true, without being the whole truth. "The old man's been drinking since noon," Blessing said, lowering her voice. "Madame Folake asked the bar staff twice already to water down his whiskey. Whatever's eating him, I hope it stays inside his own head and not out here with the rest of us." Adaeze said nothing to that, only nodded, and went back to arranging skewers on her tray with the particular concentration of someone who had learned that agreeing too loudly with any observation about the Adeyemi family could cost you more than it was worth. She had been 22 when she first walked through the estate staff entrance, 4 years and 1 month after her mother's death, and 1 week after her grandmother's, with nothing to her name but a change of clothes, a single photograph, and a trunk she'd carried on the bus from Ajegunle, with both arms wrapped around it like it might be taken from her if she loosened her grip. The agency that placed her hadn't asked many questions. Neither had Mrs. Folake Adeyemi, who'd hired her on the spot after a 15-minute interview, the only person in that household who had ever, in 4 years, asked Adaeze a question about her life that wasn't related to a task. Adaeze moved through the crowd with a brass tray balanced on one palm, offering skewers of grilled tilapia and small glasses of sobolo to guests who looked past her the way you look past a lamppost. She had learned this skill the way she'd learned everything else that kept her safe in this house. Make no sound, hold no opinion, take up no more space than the tray in your hands. She had worked in the Adeyemi household for 4 years, since she was 22, since the week after her grandmother died, and left her with nothing but a small room's worth of belongings, and no one left in the world to call family. Ozioma Nwosu had raised Adaeze from the time she was 12, when Adaeze's mother, Chiamaka, died of a fever that turned to pneumonia in the space of 9 days, because the family didn't have the money for the hospital until it was already too late. Ozioma had never spoken much about her own younger life. She spoke instead through her hands, through the particular way she moved through a small room, like the room had music in it, even when the radio was off. She had died 3 years ago, quietly, in her sleep, in the same one-room flat in Ajegunle, where she'd raised 2 generations of women alone. Adaeze had brought almost nothing with her into the Adeyemi household: a change of clothes, a photograph of her mother she could barely remember, and a pair of old dance shoes wrapped in a faded piece of aquete cloth, kept at the bottom of a trunk under her narrow staff quarters bed, worn down at the heel in a way that told you they'd been danced in for years before they were ever put away. She had never told anyone in this house that she could dance. She had certainly never told anyone that the shoes under her bed had belonged to a woman who, decades before Adaeze was born, had been one of the most talked-about tango dancers in the nightclubs of old Lagos, before something happened that made her stop dancing in public forever and never once explain why. Tonight, something in the air felt different. The guests whispered more than usual, casting glances toward Chief Tunde Adeyemi, who stood near the orchestra with a whiskey in each hand by 9 o'clock, his face flushed with more than alcohol. Adaeze had watched this man for 4 years. She knew the particular color his face turned when he wanted to crush something. She had seen it before, twice. Once when a supplier delivered the wrong marble for a hotel lobby 3 weeks behind schedule, and once when a junior manager questioned a decision in front of investors. Both times, Tunde had smiled through the entire conversation, which was, Adaeze had learned, the most dangerous thing his face could do. He was smiling now, moving between clusters of guests with a whiskey in each hand, and Bisola trailed a step behind him all evening, with the particular restlessness of someone waiting for a performance to begin. Adaeze had spent the earlier part of the evening trying not to notice any of it, focusing instead on the mechanics of her tray, the weight distribution of 8 full glasses, the practiced angle of her wrist that kept nothing from spilling, no matter how the crowd shifted around her. It was easier to disappear into a task than to wonder what was coming. She had learned that lesson in this house the way she'd learned most lessons here, by getting it wrong once and paying for it in ways that took weeks to stop stinging. "Attention, everyone, if I may." Tunde's voice cut through the room with the ease of a man who had never once in his life needed to raise it twice. Adaeze drifted toward a pillar near the edge of the room, tray in hand, trying to fold herself into the shadows the way she'd folded herself into every room in this house for 4 years. An old instinct, sharper than she could explain, told her that tonight the shadows would not hold. Tunde climbed the 3 steps to the small stage where the evening's hired orchestra had been playing since dinner. Mr. Lawal, the band leader, stepped back from his podium with the careful, practiced smile of a man who had learned long ago not to occupy the same space as his employer's ego. "Tonight is special," Tunde said, "not just because I've reached 68, but because I want to share something with all of you. My father built 3 hotels with his bare hands and his own stubbornness. I built an empire on top of them, 40 properties across 3 countries, more rooms under the Adeyemi name than any other family in this part of the continent. And tonight, I want to remind everyone in this room what real excellence looks like, the kind you're born with, not the kind you can buy or fake your way into." A ripple of appreciative murmurs moved through guests who had, themselves, spent considerable sums trying to buy exactly that kind of excellence for their own children, in conservatories and boarding schools and expensive tutors, with results that varied more than any of them liked to admit out loud. Polite laughter, a few claps. Adaeze's stomach tightened at the particular shape the room's attention was starting to take. "Bisola, my dear, would you fetch our special guest?" Bisola Adeyemi pushed through the crowd wearing the smile Adaeze had learned to fear more than any raised voice in this house. The smile that came right before something expensive got broken and blamed on her. The smile that came right before a paycheck got docked for a reason no one bothered to explain. Bisola walked straight to Adaeze without hesitation and snatched the tray from her hands. "You," Bisola said. "Father wants you." "I'm not." Adaeze started to step back, but two guests who'd been watching with the particular interest of people hoping for a scene closed the gap behind her. "Don't be shy," Bisola said, gripping Adaeze's arm. "It's your moment to shine." The crowd's laughter grew louder as Adaeze was pushed onto the small stage, 200 pairs of eyes fixing on her at once. Eyes that had never once looked at her directly, in 4 years of passing her in hallways. Tunde looked her over slowly, the particular disdain of a man assessing something beneath his notice. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, "allow me to introduce Adaeze Nwosu. She cleans our floors, launders our linens, and serves our food." Each word landed like a small, deliberate stone. "Tonight, my daughter tells me our domestic staff has been boasting to the other help that she learned to dance tango from her grandmother. Is that true, Adaeze?" Adaeze's throat closed. Years of swallowed silence pressed against the inside of her chest. "I asked if it's true," Tunde said, louder. "Yes," Adaeze whispered. "I can't hear you." "Yes," she said again, barely louder. "I learned from my grandmother." The laughter that followed shook the chandeliers. Adaeze squeezed her eyes shut, willing the marble floor to open beneath her feet. "Incredible," Tunde said, circling her the way a man circles something he's already decided isn't quite human. "Learned it between the smell of bleach and dish soap, I imagine." More laughter. Adaeze felt tears rising and refused, with everything left in her, to let them fall. "Now, Adaeze." Tunde stopped directly in front of her, whiskey heavy on his breath. "I have a proposition. A wager, if you like." The room quieted, even the drunkest guests leaning forward. "If you dance this tango, and truly show us what tango is, then I will marry you myself, right here, before every person in this room." A ripple of stunned laughter and scattered whistles moved through the crowd. "But if you stumble, or prove yourself nothing more than a foolish girl who's been telling stories to make herself feel important, then you're finished in this house tonight. No pay owed. No reference. Not 1 naira. Tunde, stop this." Mrs. Folake Adeyemi's voice cracked from her corner of the ballroom, but Tunde silenced her with a glance that had silenced her for 30 years. "Do you accept?" Tunde extended his hand, mocking, certain of the answer. Time narrowed to the width of that outstretched hand. Adaeze looked past it, at 200 faces gleaming with anticipation and cruelty, at Bisola's predatory grin, at Folake's guilty, helpless tears. She thought, for one long second, about the trunk under her bed, about the shoes wrapped in cloth she'd never once shown another living soul in this house, about 4 years of making herself small enough to survive in rooms exactly like this one. She thought about walking away instead, out the service door, into whatever came next for a woman with no job and no reference, and nothing left to lose that she hadn't already lost twice before. And in that narrowing silence, she heard her grandmother's voice the way she'd heard it 1,000 times over a crackling kitchen radio. "Tango is not danced with the feet, my girl. It is danced with the soul, and your soul is bigger than this whole house put together." "I accept," Adaeze said. Her voice was quiet. It still managed to silence the room like a struck bell. "Before the music even starts, has anyone ever underestimated you so completely that you actually got to enjoy proving them wrong? Tell me what happened, and what it felt like the moment they realized." Tunde blinked, momentarily caught off guard by an answer he clearly hadn't expected. He'd braced for tears, for a shaking apology, for a quiet retreat toward the kitchen. This was not in his calculations. "Excellent," he said, recovering. "No one will ever say Chief Tunde Adeyemi broke a promise. Mr. Lawal, play the most demanding piece you know. Let everyone see how our domestic staff dares to dance a real tango." Mr. Lawal approached the center of the stage, his eyes resting on Adaeze for a moment longer than necessary. "Sir, are you certain? The tango I know isn't something to be imitated by an amateur." "That's precisely the point," Tunde said. "I want everyone here to see the difference between real talent and a foolish girl's delusion." Mr. Lawal nodded slowly and returned to his musicians. Before he did, he leaned toward Adaeze and said something low enough that no one else caught it. "I don't know how you learned to dance, young lady," he murmured, "but whoever taught you understood La Comparsita better than half the professionals I've shared a stage with. Trust your feet. They already know more than this room does." Whatever it was, something shifted across Adaeze's face, and she gave the smallest possible nod. "La Comparsita," Mr. Lawal told his orchestra. "The full arrangement. Don't hold anything back." A murmur moved through guests who knew tango well enough to recognize the name, one of the most demanding, emotionally punishing pieces the genre had ever produced, requiring not just technique, but a soul old enough to carry decades of loss inside 4 minutes of music. Tunde's jaw tightened. He hadn't expected his bandleader to choose something so serious. It was too late to walk it back now. He glanced toward his wife, who was watching the stage with an expression he couldn't quite place, somewhere between dread and something that looked almost like hope, and he found himself, for reasons he couldn't name, unable to hold her gaze for more than a second. "She'll need a partner," he said, forcing a cruel smile. "Who here is brave enough to humiliate themselves alongside our domestic staff?" Laughter. No one moved. Bisola had not simply guessed at Adaeze's secret. 2 weeks earlier, walking back from a friend's house past midnight, she'd glimpsed Adaeze through the lit window of the staff quarters, alone, barefoot, moving through a slow turn in the cramped space between her bed and the wall, eyes closed, an old cassette player propped on the windowsill playing something scratchy and foreign. Bisola had watched for almost a full minute before she understood what she was seeing, and something ugly and immediate had risen in her chest that she hadn't examined too closely at the time. She'd told her father the very next morning, dressing it up as amusement, as a funny thing worth teasing the help about at the party. She had not expected, and would spend the rest of the night regretting, exactly how far her father would decide to take the joke. Bisola had spent 3 years at a dance conservatory in London that her father's money had purchased for her outright, and had quit after 18 months when a visiting instructor told her, gently but plainly, that her technique was correct and her feeling was absent. She had never told anyone that part of the story. Watching Adaeze through that window, moving with an ease Bisola had paid enormous sums of money and never once achieved, had felt less like discovering a secret and more like having an old wound reopened by someone who didn't even know it existed. The scent of the ballroom's white lilies, banked in tall vases along the stage, reached Adaeze in that silence, and for a half-second, she wasn't standing in front of 200 strangers at all. She was 11 years old in a one-room flat in Ajagunle, the air thick with the smell of her grandmother's shea butter and the dust of a radio that only got 2 stations clearly. And Ozioma Nwosu was pushing the single table against the wall to clear space on a cracked linoleum floor. "Tango is a conversation, my girl," her grandmother used to say, guiding Adaeze's small hands into position, her voice low and unhurried, even when the landlord was banging on the door about rent 2 days late. A desperate conversation between 2 people who can't say the truth to each other any other way. Adaeze had learned her first steps in that cramped room before she'd learned to properly read, her grandmother's rough, work-worn hands closing over her own, correcting her posture with a patience she'd never once shown toward complaint or self-pity, humming a melody under her breath that Adaeze wouldn't hear again, note for note, until an orchestra played it back to her 20 years later, in a ballroom she'd never expected to stand inside as anything other than staff. "You have your grandmother's shoulders," Ozioma had told her once, On one of the rare evenings she'd talked about her own dancing at all. Keep them soft. A hard shoulder tells the whole room you're afraid. A soft one tells them you've already decided not to be. Adaeze hadn't understood the lesson at 11. She understood it completely now, 200 pairs of eyes fixed on her, her shoulders dropping into the exact position her grandmother had spent years correcting. "I will." The voice came from the back of the ballroom, near the main entrance. A young man in a faded but carefully pressed suit walked forward, with the kind of steady, unhurried steps that told you he'd already decided something and wasn't going to be talked out of it. "Emeka?" Tunde squinted. "Aren't you the groundskeeper's son I let go 2 years ago?" "I was invited tonight," Emeka said evenly. "Mrs. Adeyemi sent for me." All eyes turned to Folake, who gave the smallest, most deliberate nod. Fury flickered across Tunde's face, but he couldn't openly contradict his wife in front of 200 guests without turning an embarrassment into a spectacle. "Do as you like," he snapped. "A domestic worker and a groundskeeper's boy. How poetic." Emeka's father had tended the Adeyemi gardens for 11 years, before Tunde let him go over a disputed invoice for fertilizer that turned out, months later, to have been entirely legitimate. No apology had followed the discovery, only a curt note informing the family they were welcome to reapply if a position opened. Emeka and Adaeze had grown up 2 streets apart in Ajegunle, sharing the particular friendship of children who understood, without ever discussing it, that neither of their families had a safety net wider than the next paycheck. Osioma Nwosu had taught them both to dance in that same cramped room, though Emeka had never taken to it the way Adaeze had, content instead to serve as her practice partner on the evenings her grandmother needed a pair of hands that weren't her own granddaughter's to demonstrate a lift. In the 2 years since his father lost the gardening position, Emeka had taken whatever work the city offered him, loading trucks before dawn, running deliveries on a borrowed motorbike, 3 months at a construction site that ended when the contractor vanished, owing him 6 weeks of pay. He had never once complained to Adaeze about any of it, the same way she had never once complained to him about the tray in her hands, or the way Bisola spoke to her like furniture. Their friendship had survived on precisely that kind of mutual silence, the two of them carrying separate versions of the same weight, and never once asking the other to carry it for them. 2 hours earlier, in a quiet study 2 floors above the ballroom, Chief Tunde Adeyemi had poured himself his second whiskey of the evening and told his longtime driver Musa something he had never said out loud to another living person in 40 years. The study smelled of old leather and the particular dust that settles on rooms used more for appearances than for living in. Tunde had asked Musa up not to drive anywhere, but simply because the party downstairs had grown too loud for a man turning 68 to sit with his own thoughts in peace, and Musa was the only person in the building he trusted enough to sit in silence with. "You've known me since I was 26, Tunde said, staring into the glass rather than at the man standing near the door. "Did I ever tell you there was someone before Folake?" Musa, who had driven for the Adeyemi family for 31 years and had learned exactly when to speak and when to simply listen, said nothing. "There was a dancer," Tunde continued, "the most extraordinary woman I ever saw in my life. My father found out I meant to marry her, instead of the wife his business partners had already picked out for me, and he gave me a choice. Her, or everything I'd grown up believing was mine by right. He drank. I chose the hotels. I've spent 40 years telling myself it was the responsible choice, the choice a serious man makes. Some nights I still believe that." He set the glass down harder than he meant to. "Other nights I wonder what kind of man spends 4 decades building an empire he can't remember choosing, over a woman he's never once stopped thinking about." "Did you ever look for her?" Musa asked, the first thing he'd said since entering the room. "Once. Years later. She'd already disappeared from every stage in this city." No one would tell me where she'd gone. Tunde turned the glass slowly in his hand, watching the liquid catch the lamplight. My father made certain of that. He had a way of making problems disappear so thoroughly that even the people looking for them gave up eventually. I told myself she'd built a better life somewhere far from a coward like me, and that not knowing was easier than knowing. You never married her, Musa said. But you never really left her either, not from where I've been sitting for 31 years. Tunde looked up sharply, something in the observation landing closer to the bone than he'd expected from a man he paid to drive him places. Careful, he said, though there was no real warning in it. I'm only saying what I've watched, sir. A man doesn't flinch at a stranger's name after 40 years, unless the name never actually became a stranger's. My father used to say, a man who lets a woman cost him his inheritance deserves to lose both. Tunde laughed, a short, humorless sound. He said it to my face the week I told him I meant to marry her. I was so afraid of becoming nothing in his eyes that I became something worse instead, and I've spent every year since telling myself the hotels were worth it. He looked at the glass in his hand, like it had personally betrayed him. I buried my father 15 years ago, Musa. I still can't walk past his old office without hearing that sentence. Then maybe tonight isn't about a housemaid at all, Musa said quietly. Maybe it's about a man still trying to prove his father wrong about what he can survive losing. Tunde didn't answer that. He finished his whiskey, straightened his jacket, and told himself, walking back down toward the ballroom, that tonight he was simply going to enjoy watching a housemaid embarrass herself in front of 200 guests. It would be good for a laugh, nothing more. A small cruelty to close out a birthday that had otherwise felt, for reasons he couldn't name, unbearably heavy. He had no way of knowing, walking back down those stairs, exactly what he was about to make an example of. Back on the stage, Emeka crossed to stand opposite Adaeze. Their eyes met with the particular ease of two people who had grown up sharing the same hard corners of the same difficult city, whose friendship had been forged years before either of them understood what money could and couldn't buy. Ready? Emeka asked quietly. With everything I've got, Adaeze said, taking his offered hand. Bisola watched from the front row with her arms crossed, already composing in her head the story she'd tell her friends tomorrow about the maid who'd humiliated herself in front of half of Lagos society. She had no idea, standing there, that the story she'd actually be telling by morning would leave her own name out of it entirely, because there would be no way to tell it without also explaining exactly how she'd set the whole evening in motion. Mr. Lawal raised his baton. 200 guests held their breath, some from curiosity, some hoping, quite plainly, for the perfect moment to laugh. And then the first notes of La Comparsita cut through the ballroom air like a blade drawn slowly from its sheath. Tunde watched from beside the stage, arms crossed, waiting to enjoy exactly the kind of stumbling, amateur spectacle he'd promised his guests. What crossed his face instead, in the first 4 bars of music, was something closer to recognition than amusement. A flicker, gone as quickly as it arrived, that he would spend the rest of the night trying to explain away and failing. If you're already hoping Adaeze wipes the floor with this wager, hit like right now before that music finishes. And tell me honestly, has anyone ever tried to use your own quiet dignity against you, the way Bisola just did to her? The first notes of La Comparsita moved through the ballroom like dry leaves caught in a sudden wind. Quiet at first, then swelling with a force that seemed to pull the air out of the room. Adaeze closed her eyes for exactly 1 beat. When she opened them, Emeka was watching her with the absolute trust of 2 decades of friendship, and she took her first step. The entire ballroom gasped. It was not the movement of a nervous girl fumbling through half-remembered lessons. It was the step of someone who had done this 1,000 times in a cramped 1-room flat, a language written so deep into her bones that her body simply remembered it the way it remembered how to breathe. Emeka led her with perfect precision, never once dominating her, the two of them moving like a single body split cleanly in half and rejoined. The cruel smile Tunde had worn for the last 20 minutes drained slowly from his face. Adaeze moved like water finding its level, like a flame finally allowed to burn as high as it wanted. There was no trace left of the girl who carried a brass tray and kept her eyes on the floor. Every turn was a quiet act of defiance. Every step answered years of practiced invisibility with a language that required no permission from anyone in that room. Mr. Lawal's eyes, watching from his podium, filled with tears he hadn't expected. He had conducted for touring soloists in concert halls 3 continents away. What was unfolding in front of him now was something else entirely. Pain transformed, in real time, into something that looked very much like grace. "What in God's name is happening?" a woman near the bar whispered to her husband. "I have no idea," he answered, unable to look away, his glass of champagne forgotten and warming in his hand. An older guest near the front, a retired judge who'd seen every touring production that had ever passed through Lagos's National Theatre, leaned toward his wife. "I haven't seen footwork like that since the 70s, he murmured, "and I couldn't tell you where I saw it then if you paid me." Near the champagne table, a hotel investor named Chief Adeyemi, who had flown in from Abuja specifically to discuss a joint venture with Tunde the following week, set down his glass entirely and simply watched, arms folded, the particular stillness of a man recalculating an evening that had started as a courtesy visit and was quickly becoming something he'd tell people about for years. Bisola stood rigid near the stage, fists clenched at her sides. This wasn't supposed to happen. The domestic worker was supposed to stumble, was supposed to hand Bisola fresh proof that everything she'd believed about the people beneath her was correct. Instead, Adaeze shone, and the shine had nowhere left to hide. Bisola's mind raced backward, unbidden, to the window she'd looked through 2 weeks ago, and for the first time that night, a small, unwelcome doubt crept in alongside the fury. The doubt that she had set something in motion she didn't actually understand. The music built toward its most demanding passage, the accordion pouring out a melody that asked for everything a dancer's body and history had to give. Emeka lifted Adaeze in a slow, gravity-defying arch, and as her spine curved backward in perfect control, gasps rose from every corner of the ballroom, and somewhere near the back, a guest's champagne glass slipped from her fingers entirely, unnoticed, rolling under a table. Tunde took an unsteady step back. His face had gone the color of old paper. He knew that movement. He had seen it once before, a very long time ago, in a life he had spent 40 years trying not to remember in detail. "It can't be," he muttered, to no one, to himself. Across the room, Mrs. Foleke Adeyemi's hands trembled violently in her lap. Whatever secret she'd been keeping for years had just cracked open in front of 200 witnesses who had no idea what they were watching. The final movement of La Comparsita arrived, the section that asked a dancer to hold nothing back, and Adaeze danced it with her eyes open, fixed on some point in the air only she could see. She danced it for her grandmother, for the cramped one-room flat, and the radio that only got 2 stations clearly. She danced it for her mother, whom she barely remembered except as a warmth and a laugh, and the smell of groundnut soup on a stove. She danced it for every year she'd spent making herself small in other people's houses, every tray carried without a sound, every insult absorbed without an answer. Emeka held her through the final descent, her body arched in complete surrender, her hair loosening from its pins and falling across her shoulder, and when the last note of the accordion faded into silence, no one in the ballroom moved for 3 full seconds. Then, from the back of the room, a single clap, then another. Within 10 seconds, 200 of Nigeria's wealthiest guests were on their feet, applause shaking the crystal overhead. Mr. Lawal remained at his podium, baton still in hand, watching Adaeze with the particular expression of a man who had spent 30 years conducting other people's talent, and had rarely, if ever, watched it announce itself so completely in a single performance. "I have never," he said quietly to no one in particular, "heard that piece played by someone who understood every single bar of it from the inside." Adaeze, still held in Emeka's arms, gasped for breath, tears sliding down her face that were, for the first time all night, not tears of shame. He stood perfectly still at the center of the room, his face carrying an expression Adaeze had never once seen from him in 4 years. Not fury, not disdain, something closer to a man watching a ghost walk calmly through his own front door. "Enough," he said, once the applause began to fade. "Everyone please, tonight's gala is over." The guests murmured in confusion, exchanging glances that suggested no one quite understood what they'd just witnessed, but understood well enough that the evening had ended somewhere very different from where it started. A few lingered near the door, whispering, hoping for one more scrap of scandal to carry into tomorrow's conversations. But Tunde's authority in that house was absolute, and within minutes, the ballroom had emptied, leaving only Tunde, Folake, Adaeze, Emeka, and Mr. Lawal, standing beneath chandeliers that now felt like silent witnesses, rather than decoration. Tunde crossed the room until he stood less than a foot from Adaeze. "Your grandmother," he said, his voice raw in a way that made him sound decades older than he had an hour ago. "What was her name?" "Ozioma," Adaeze said. "Ozioma." A sound came out of Tunde that wasn't quite a word, something closer to the sound a man makes when the air has been forced out of his lungs against his will. "Ozioma," he repeated, as though testing whether the syllables could still hurt him after 40 years, and finding that they could. "You knew her?" Adaeze asked. Her voice carried something new now, not accusation, but a hunger for an answer she'd spent her whole life not knowing she was owed. Tunde couldn't speak. Folake, in the corner, had risen from her chair, the champagne flute she'd been holding, shattering unnoticed on the marble floor. Emeka moved closer to Adaeze's side without being asked, a quiet, steady presence, the same way he'd stood beside her at her grandmother's funeral 3 years earlier, when no one else from the house had bothered to attend, the same way he'd stood beside her at her mother's funeral 14 years before that, though he'd only been 12 himself, and hadn't fully understood then what he understood now about the particular kind of loyalty that doesn't need to be asked for twice. "You don't owe him anything," he said, low enough that only she could hear it. "Not patience, not forgiveness, not even staying in this room another minute if you don't want to." "I know," Adaeze said. "I want to hear it anyway." She said it steadily, the same steadiness her grandmother had spent years teaching into her shoulders, her spine, the set of her chin. "I loved her," Tunde finally said, "before I ever built a single hotel, before my father decided what my life was going to look like. I was 26, she was 21, and the moment I watched her dance for the first time, in a club that doesn't exist anymore, I knew nothing in my life would ever be the same." He walked slowly toward the tall windows overlooking the dark garden. "My father found out I meant to marry her instead of the woman his business partners had chosen for me. He gave me an ultimatum. Her, or the hotels, the inheritance, the entire life I'd grown up believing, belonged to me by right." "What was she like?" Adaeze asked, and for a moment the question wasn't about revenge or reckoning at all. It was simply a granddaughter, starved for detail, asking about a woman she'd only ever known as tired and gentle, and prone to humming under her breath. Tunde's face softened in a way none of them had seen from him all evening. "Fearless," he said. "She walked into rooms like this one, like she owned the floor beneath her feet, and she'd grown up with less than any of these 200 people combined. She used to say money was just a story people agreed to believe together, and dancing was the only thing she'd ever seen that was actually true. He shook his head slowly. I believed every word she said until the day my father sat me down and reminded me exactly how much of my life depended on staying inside the story. She was already dancing at the National Theater by the time she was your age, Tunde continued, almost to himself now, the memory pulling him further from the room than any of them could follow. Critics wrote about her the way people write about weather systems, like something too large to properly contain in a sentence. I used to sit in the third row 4 nights a week just to watch her walk off stage. My father called it an infatuation. It was the only true thing I'd felt in 26 years of being handed everything I ever asked for. So what did you choose? Adaeze asked, though something in her chest already knew. I chose the money, Tunde said. I chose to be a coward, and I have had 40 years to understand exactly what that word means. Folake spoke for the first time, her voice thick. Tunde, please. Not like this. It has to be like this, Folake. He didn't look at her. How many more years am I supposed to watch this go on? Watch what go on? Adaeze's voice had gone very quiet. What are you talking about? Tunde turned to face her fully, and for the first time in 4 years of serving this man his breakfast and ironing his shirts, Adaeze watched him look at her as though he were actually seeing her. When your grandmother and I parted ways, Tunde said, I never knew she was already carrying a child. My child. A daughter. His voice cracked entirely on the last word. Your mother, Adaeze. Chiamaka was my daughter, which makes you. The sentence didn't need finishing. The ballroom seemed to tilt sideways beneath Adaeze's feet, and Emeka's hand closed around her arm before her knees fully understood what her mind had just been told. Tunde's face went the color of ash as the full shape of what he'd said an hour earlier finally caught up to him. I offered to marry my own granddaughter, he said, the words barely audible, horror dawning across his features in slow motion. In front of 200 people. I stood on that stage and mocked a child of my own blood with a wager I meant as an insult. He sank onto the arm of a nearby chair, unable to hold his own weight. What kind of man does that make me? The same kind of man who spent 40 years not asking a single question he was afraid of the answer to, Adaeze said. It wasn't cruelty in her voice. It was simply the truth, delivered the way her grandmother had taught her to deliver truth, plainly, without flourish, and without asking anyone's permission first. Folake crossed the room slowly and stood in front of Adaeze, her hands trembling. I need you to know, I never knew, she said. Whatever else you decide to believe about this family, believe that. I married a man carrying a grief he never once explained to me, and I spent 30 years assuming it was simply his nature. Bisola stood frozen near the stage steps, the predatory grin she'd worn all evening long gone, replaced by something closer to a child watching the ground open beneath a house she'd assumed was built on solid stone. She's my, Bisola started, and couldn't finish the sentence any better than her father had finished his. Niece, Adaeze said, when no one else would. I believe that's the word. Mr. Lawal, still standing near the piano, looked between the 4 of them with the quiet, careful expression of a man who understood he had just watched a family assemble itself out of 40 years of silence, in real time, in front of an emptied ballroom. He said nothing. Some rooms, he had learned over a long career of watching other people's most private moments unfold in public, needed a witness more than they needed a voice. If that landed on you the way it just landed on Adaeze, subscribe right now, because what this man does with that guilt over the following months is the part that actually changed how I saw him. Emeka drove Adaeze to her old staff quarters that night, neither of them speaking much, the city sliding past dark and quiet outside the car windows. She sat with her grandmother's dance shoes in her lap, pulled from the trunk under her bed the moment she'd been able to stand on her own legs again, holding them the way you hold the one object in the world that might explain everything, if you just pressed hard enough into its worn leather. "You don't have to talk about it tonight," Emeka said, eyes on the road. "Whatever you need, I'm not going anywhere." "I know," Adaeze said. "That's the only thing I'm sure of right now." She found what she was looking for at the bottom of the same trunk, wrapped inside the akwete cloth alongside the shoes. A letter, sealed, her grandmother's careful handwriting on the front. For Adaeze, if the day ever comes when she needs to know. Ozioma had never told her it existed. Perhaps she'd hoped the day would never come. Perhaps she'd simply run out of time to decide. The letter confirmed everything Tunde had said, and one thing more. Ozioma had never intended to hide Chiamaka out of spite. She had done it, the letter said, because a frightened 21-year-old woman with no money and no family name to protect her had watched exactly how far the Adeyemi family's reach extended once Tunde's father decided she was an inconvenience, to be erased from every stage in the city. She hadn't trusted that the truth would protect her daughter. She had trusted, instead, that raising her far from that reach was the safest gift she had left to give. "I never hated him for choosing the money," the letter read. "I only ever wished he'd been brave enough to ask what it cost me. If you are reading this, my darling girl, it means the world finally found you anyway. Dance like you were never told to be small. That was always the only inheritance I had to leave you." Adaeze read the letter 3 times before she could set it down. Emeka sat beside her the whole time, saying nothing, which she would remember afterward as the exact right thing for a friend to do. Tunde did not try to buy his way into forgiveness, and Adaeze would come to respect him more for that than for anything else he did in the months that followed. He didn't offer her a check. He didn't ask her to move into the main house and take up a life she'd never trained for and didn't especially want. Instead, 3 days after the gala, he sat across from her at his own kitchen table, in the same kitchen she'd cleaned every morning for 4 years, and asked her what she actually wanted. "I want my grandmother's name back," Adaeze said, not quietly, not in some private conversation between us. "I want the whole country to know who Ozioma Nwosu was, and what your family did to make sure no one remembered." "Done," Tunde said, "whatever it costs." "And I don't want a gift," Adaeze added. "I want a real position, something I earn every day, not something you hand me because your conscience needs it more than I need a paycheck. Name it, and it's yours to build, not to receive, to build." "There's one more thing," Adaeze said. "Bisola stays out of it entirely, unless she asks to be part of it herself, on her own terms, and earns whatever role she's given, the same way anyone else would." She paused. "I'm not interested in punishing her, the way this family has spent 40 years punishing people who threatened its comfort. I'm interested in making sure it stops being a family that does that at all." Tunde nodded slowly, something like relief passing over his features, as though he'd expected a harder bargain and found instead a fairer one than he deserved. "And Foleke?" he asked. "What do you want from her?" "Nothing she hasn't already given me," Adaeze said. "She's the only person in this house who ever asked me a real question in 4 years. That already counts for more than you'd think." Tunde nodded slowly, and for the first time in the 4 years Adaeze had known him, she watched him actually listen to a member of his own staff, instead of simply waiting for his turn to talk. 2 months later, Tunde stood in front of a small crowd of journalists and cultural historians at the National Theatre, the same institution that had quietly stopped booking Ozioma Nwosu 40 years earlier, under pressure no one had ever put in writing. He didn't read from a prepared statement. He told them, plainly, what his family had done, and what it had cost a woman whose name deserved to be remembered for her artistry, rather than for how thoroughly she'd been erased. "I am not here today because it is good for my company," he said, looking directly into the cameras, rather than past them the way he usually did. I am here because a woman who taught half of Lagos how to move through the world with dignity died without a single institution in this country willing to say her name out loud. That ends today. Adaeze stood at the back of the room during the announcement, arms crossed, watching a man she'd spent 4 years fearing finally use his considerable voice for something other than himself. It made the newspapers the following morning, not as a scandal, but as a correction decades overdue. 6 months later, the Ozioma Nwosu Dance Academy opened its doors in Ajegunle, 4 blocks from the one-room flat where Adaeze had learned her first steps on a cracked linoleum floor. Tunde funded the building and the instructors' salaries in full, but the academy answered to no one but its director, and its director was Adaeze Nwosu, 26 years old, who had spent 4 years carrying trays through a house that never once asked her name until the night it finally had to. Bisola did not become a different person overnight. The first few months, she could barely look at Adaeze across a room, caught somewhere between resentment and a shame she didn't yet have the vocabulary to name. But she showed up, eventually, to the academy's second open house, standing awkwardly near the back, and by the academy's first anniversary, she had quietly begun donating a portion of her own allowance toward scholarships for students who couldn't afford the modest fees. It wasn't forgiveness. It was, Adaeze decided, close enough to a beginning to count. At the anniversary event, Bisola approached Adaeze near the refreshment table, visibly working up to something. I quit dancing because a teacher told me the truth about my technique once, and it broke something in me I never fixed, she said, the words coming out stiff, unpracticed. Watching you that night wasn't just humiliating. It reminded me of exactly what I gave up on. I'm not asking you to feel sorry for me. I just wanted you to know it wasn't only cruelty. Some of it was grief I didn't know what to do with. Adaeze considered that for a long moment. Come to Tuesday classes if you want, she finally said. Not as my cousin, as a student, same as anyone else who walks through that door. Bisola nodded, and it was the first genuinely quiet moment the two of them had ever shared in the same room. Emeka became the academy's assistant director, teaching partner work to teenagers who reminded Adaeze, more than she expected, of 2 children clearing furniture out of the way on a cracked linoleum floor a lifetime ago. On the academy's opening night, Adaeze stood at the front of a small rehearsal hall that smelled of new paint and old dreams. 40 students seated in front of her, none of them wealthy, all of them there because someone had finally decided their talent was worth building a room around. A week before the opening, Tunde had asked to accompany her to the small cemetery outside Ajegunle, where Chiamaka was buried, a request Adaeze had agreed to only after 3 days of thinking it over. He had stood at the foot of the grave for a long time, saying nothing, an old man in an expensive coat looking, for the first time Adaeze had ever seen, entirely without power. I don't have the right to grieve her the way you do, he'd finally said, but I'd like your permission to grieve her at all. Adaeze had given it, not because the request undid anything, but because refusing it would have cost her something she'd decided she no longer wanted to carry. She reached into a bag at her feet and drew out a pair of worn dance shoes, the leather soft with age, the heels reshaped by decades of use before she'd ever been born. These belong to my grandmother, she told the room, no longer hiding them under a bed, no longer folding them back into cloth the moment anyone looked too closely. She taught me that tango isn't danced with the feet. It's danced with whatever you're still carrying that the world tried to convince you to put down. She slipped them on, laces worn soft from a lifetime of hands other than her own. Tonight, I'm putting them on in front of people, for the first time in my life, without being afraid of who might be watching. Here is the one thing I want you to take from this today. The people the world decides not to look at are very often the ones carrying the most worth looking at. It costs nothing to look twice. It only costs the assumption that you already know what you'd find. This story is fiction, but the invisibility it's built on is not. The International Labor Organization estimates there are more than 75 million domestic workers worldwide, the overwhelming majority of them women, and in most countries they remain among the least legally protected workers in any industry, often excluded entirely from standard labor laws that cover nearly everyone else. If you know someone who's been quietly carrying a gift the world has never bothered to notice, send them this today. And subscribe, because next time, it's someone else's turn to finally be seen.